You're listening to Love and Libido with me, your host, Dr. Emily Jamia. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inspire. My hope is that you will learn tools to create connection and cultivate passion, both within yourself and in your relationships. Here's what's coming up on today's episode. Are you or your partner one of the many people who find it really hard to focus during sex? Have you ever wondered whether you might have ADHD? Do you have ADHD and struggle to maintain healthy relationships and satisfying sexual experiences? Then you need to listen to today's episode. My guest and I are going to do a deep dive into the effect of ADHD on sex and love. ADHD can have a lot of symptoms and can present differently for different people. Whether you have a formal diagnosis or not, you'll learn tips that will help improve your relationship, keep you focused, experience pleasure, and deepen intimacy. Let's get started. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. I'm thrilled to have today's guest on, Dr. Stephanie Buehler. She is someone who I have known through our professional organization, ASECT, for many, many years, and she is so knowledgeable about so many things, and it was really hard to narrow down our topic for today, but I think we finally did, and we are going to be talking all about ADHD and its effect on relationships and sex. Before we get to all of that, because there is a lot to discuss, let me introduce our guest. So Dr. Stephanie Buehler is a licensed psychologist and ASECT certified sex therapist and supervisor. She is director of the Buehler Institute and creator of LearnSexTherapy.com, which provides continuing education in sex and relationship therapy for psychotherapists and wellness providers. Dr. Buehler specializes in sexuality and chronic illness and cancer, sexual pain disorders, and sexuality and mental health. Dr. Buehler is the author of several books, including a best-selling textbook, What Every Mental Health Professional Needs to Know About Sex. Dr. Buehler has spoken to professional audiences all over the U.S. and around the globe and is frequently quoted in the media, most recently in The Atlantic, Men's Health, and Business Insider. Dr. Buehler, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I really do appreciate it. And I'm excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today.
I know. So before we dive in, because there is a lot to discuss about today's topic, can you tell me a little bit about your backstory and how you got into the field of sexuality and mental health?
You know, when I think back, I was always interested in sex. I really was. It was something that, I noticed in, how people interacted and, just the vibe that people gave out around sex. It was just always like somebody that was kind of curious about it. And then when I went to school to get my doctorate, it wasn't a thing, to study sexuality. And yet I thought to myself, there's a lot going on that I'm not talking to people about that has to do with their sexuality. And so when I got out of school, I had this sort of idea in my head that maybe that would be something that I would look into. Fortunately, an endocrinologist that I knew asked me if I would join her in creating a wellness center. And endocrinologists test hormones. People are always coming in and saying, I don't have any drive. Please test my hormones. What she told me is it's hardly ever somebody's hormones. It's usually something else going on, their relationship or some way that they're thinking about their sexuality. So if you learn sex therapy, I'll be able to refer people to you. And I thought, okay, it's a sign I'm supposed to do this. And the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so true. I think people are so quick to want to blame their hormones for everything. And as you and I both know, that is very rarely the case. If there was a magic pill, whoever invented that pill would be sailing on a yacht somewhere in the Mediterranean, I think, because it just doesn't exist. Sexuality is so complex. And I'm with you. I think when we start asking people about their sexuality, we learn so much about them. It's like a window into their psyche, into their mental health, into their relationship health. And, now it's become a more popular area of study to focus on. But I imagine back when you started getting into it. And even when I started getting into it, I mean, when I started in Houston, I was one of like 3 certified therapists in a city of, 4.5 million people. So it's important.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
very much
Yeah.
so.
So, as I said at the beginning, it was hard to narrow down a topic because you are so knowledgeable. And I'll never forget, you wrote a book called, I think it was called Sex, Love, and Mental Health, right? Or
Well, it's actually sex, love, and mental illness.
Sex, Love, and Mental Illness.
Yep.
And I'll never forget, I had a copy of it sitting on my desk, and I had a client who was one of those guys who was just a man of few words. But when he did say something, you really had to pay attention because it was usually profound. So you had your book, Sex, Love, and Mental Illness, sitting on my desk, and he walked by and he looked at it and he said, "It does happen in that order, doesn't it?" So we all had a good laugh. And I just loved that. That story will always stand out to me. And so I thought that was funny. But our mental health does affect our sexuality profoundly. And I finally, after looking through everything you sent me, decided I wanted to zero in on ADHD because I think it's so widely diagnosed now. It's something a lot of people struggle with. And a lot of people, maybe who don't even have a formal ADHD diagnosis, struggle to focus during sex. So I want to hear from you just generally. What is ADHD? What are some of its defining features and how can it present differently in different people?
Right. Well, so first of all, one of the things I want to say is, these days I keep hearing the word monolith. This group of people is not a monolith, and ADHD is definitely not a monolithic diagnosis because there are two flavors. So there's ADHD that's an inattentive type, and then there's an ADHD that's more like a hyperactive type. One is characterized by kind of like losing focus, daydreaming, losing things, having difficulty keeping appointments, staying organized, staying on top of things, just kind of a lot of disorganization. There can be social things that go on too. Sometimes people with ADHD have a hard time reading social cues and don't know how to like jump into a conversation or something like that. There can be some social things going on. And then there's a type that's like the fidgety type, the like always on the go, has impulse control problems. They're the ones, as a teacher for 10 years. So I think about that kid who was always like up out of their seat and, moving around the room, and the teacher's like, sit down, or stop talking. Boys get diagnosed with that more often, but I think it gets missed in girls or women. Women tend to be very like talkative. That's how their sort of hyperactivity and impulsivity shows up, very talkative. And on the other hand, girls tend to get diagnosed more with the inattentive type, the daydreamy type. But certainly there are lots of guys who are kind of,
The
kind of
absent-minded
like spacing
professor.
out
Yeah.
and, can't focus on their work and can't concentrate. So that's ADHD.
Yeah. And then there are people who have elements of both, which is
Yes.
a lot of fun, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So there's a lot of overlap between ADHD symptoms and anxiety disorders. So can you talk, if someone is hearing some of these symptoms and thinking, oh my gosh, like I do that sometimes, how would they know if maybe, well, I know they obviously need to go for a formal evaluation, but what might lead them to suspect that they might have ADHD versus like an anxiety problem?
I think ADHD, and well, here's what I think. I think anxiety often shows up. I mean, certainly you can have the kind of racy thoughts and even irrational thoughts, worry all the time. But I think there are a lot of physical symptoms that go along with anxiety, and they can be all kinds of interesting things. I mean, things that would don't, like I had a nervous cough during COVID. I didn't realize, oh, that cough was like a nervous cough. That was my anxiety.
If you liked this video, drop me a like and subscribe below. Share with a friend who might find it interesting. You can also listen to this in podcast form anywhere podcasts are streamed by searching for Love and Libido with Dr. Emily Jamia. Finally, follow me across all social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamia for daily emotional and physical intimacy tips.